Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here. And I changed my talk title. I almost changed the slide too with the red eye, but I didn't. I resisted. But I wanted to talk a little bit, and I think some of the things I was going to say, thankfully, have been said by all the speakers before me, so probably much more poetically. But I wanted to talk a little bit about not the future work and the future, but about I've been studying, my background is trying to figure out how does education evolve to keep up with preparing people to sort of be creators and leaders in this future rather than consumers, which is kind of what we're trained to be. And I've been reading articles and predictions about the future of work and the future of technology and innovation, and I wanted to talk, I wave my hands when I talk, so carrying these things is kind of dangerous. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I saw. And what I saw is nothing, these are all images from articles. I've decided that instead of sort of having words, sometimes I will just do a collage of all the things I see to capture the things. But these are all images from articles that are about the future of work. And then the words sort of reflect that. What does the future look like? It's all about technology. It's all about, strangely enough, still cubicles and men in suits carrying briefcases. So apparently some things are still the same. But it's this very narrow mindset, and it makes it seem as though this future is defined already, and it's here. Our job is to figure out how to adapt to it and survive, and maybe succeed if we're sort of a privileged few. But there's no context, so it doesn't recognize that work happens in a system. And we've talked about that system a little bit, but there's very little mention in this future of people and systems and environment and the impact of what this future is and what this technology that's certain in the future, which is mostly robots, AI, data, immersive media, but there's a sense somehow that things like climate change, of consumption, of energy use, of just deep social inequities, which we see around us, of deep sort of health and medical issues, are not a response to this technology, that this technology is separate. And there's no indication that maybe the future of work should include trying to address these issues, or at least being thoughtful or intentional about the technology so that it has impact, that it solves these problems. We're preparing people to solve these problems and acknowledging these problems exist. And you start thinking about who has access to the future. There are 20 million families, households in this country that don't have broadband. And probably either 15 million are urban, so it's affordability, and another 5 million are rural, and it's because it's not economically feasible for a company to spend the money to actually put fiber lines to their houses. They're not going to have broadband unless somebody does something about it. And so they have no access to this. They can't do homework. They can't do research. They can't learn. In addition to broadband, there's sort of affordability of technology, of devices. So this future is for very few, and this future involves the design of technology for very few. And so you start thinking, who decided that this was the future? Who makes these decisions? And why? We're sitting here in this room, and we have all sorts of really interesting, serious things going on around us. We have a political election happening. We have an epidemic happening. And technology is one of the powerful things about it is it is incredibly fast. It can mobilize people in all over the place very quickly and make a huge impact. And yet, we don't seem to be directing our energy that way. So I started to look at who decides, other than the machines, who are we allowing to define our future? So I started looking at who's writing these articles, what are the technologies they're talking about, who runs those companies, who's running sort of the ed tech companies that are deciding what we do, who's sort of editors, and this is what I found. I had to leave. I actually had more pictures, and then I thought, no, that looks too much. But unfortunately, nothing changed when I added this. And you can see, this is the future. So, and that is fundamentally the issue. There are a very small, privileged few who are very homogenous, get to define the future. There are, if you look really closely, 3 women in this list. 2 of whom are presidents of West Coast state schools, so that's pretty much it. And I kept trying to find, looking for more companies, more VCs saying, oh, it'll get more diverse, and it got worse, and so I stopped. Last year, for example, and these are decision makers, there was more VC investment in WeWork in 2019 than there was in all female entrepreneur startup companies put together. Just so we're making decisions. And part of it is that the UN development just came up with a gender social index today, and they said 9 out of 10 people have at least one bias against women that is impeding their progress. And so that includes like a significant percentage of this is 75 countries, think men make better political leaders, in spite of a lot of evidence to the contrary, and better business executives and men, and so that is a fundamental issue. There are 3 things, maybe 2, that I wanted to bring up related to that. One is sort of this equality of opportunity project. We don't see women and people of color and parents and low-income people as leaders, and so they lose access. They don't get the opportunity to be leaders, to be innovators, to create. They get fewer and fewer sort of opportunities, and they also self-filter because they don't see mentors, they don't see teachers, they don't see people like them who support them. We frame this often as though somehow diversity and inclusion is about bringing people in for their sakes, but it's really, think about it, there's so many ideas we've lost. We would have solutions if we included more people and more ideas. People with different perspectives, people who had sort of different cultural contexts and empathy and intention. So there's that. The second thing I wanted to talk about is bad design. What are the consequences of having a very small group of people who have very limited perspective design technology? Well, you have bad design. You have something like social media, which sounds great, but the sort of mindset in technology and innovation, and it's similar to the mindset in science, my background is in mathematics, is let's see if this is possible. Well, if it is, let's just do it, and then we'll watch and see what happens. We don't think about consequences, we don't think about impact, we don't think about the system that it lives in. And so we end up with things like disinformation and its impact on democracy. We don't think about sort of consumption and its impact on the environment and on our weather and our future. And we don't think about things like, we don't think about sort of the impact of designing for very few. So if you look at it, most things are not designed for women. So pharmaceuticals, women are significantly underrepresented in drug trials, so they're not tested for side effects. Science tools in the military or in scientific equipment or medical devices are not designed for women, so automatically they're ruled out of certain sort of labor markets because they're adapting constantly. So I think that is part of the issue. We need better diversity in the people who are leaders, and there is a path to that, and that is sort of what I wanted to spend most of my talk on. Well, not really too much, which is education. Ultimately, education is the thing that can give us sort of power and mobility, and that confidence to be leaders. But that is something we're failing at, and I say this from an entire career in higher ed that I sort of kind of left. But education should really be about preparing people to be leaders, about how do you take ideas that have impact, how do you design, and in this future of work, how do you do things that are innovative but are done with an ethical, critical lens that are for everybody. And so part of what I wanted to talk about is what does the future of education look like so that it is not so far behind that what we're preparing people for to be consumers of technology. And I say consumers in that we're all, we're told we should learn to code so that we can work in a company, rather than we should be creating the languages that code. Maybe there are better ways to think about algorithms. So I think of it as how do we develop the fluency to really be leaders in this world? And that's what I kind of wanted to talk about the project I'm working on with lots of other people at this point, which is something I call for now SETI. And it's to try to imagine a future system of education that is focused on empowering and mobilizing a community to really design technology, to design policy, to have fluency with data so that we can address the sort of major social issues, but so that we can also have a critical lens of the impact and the consequences of this and keep things from being designed. And so the question is, how do we do that through higher ed and through other systems? And so this, I think, has to be a systemic change. It's not one organization. It has to be a collaboration. And so for education to at all be relevant, for one thing, it has to be lifelong. It is no longer a linear single pathway. And it has to be bite-sized, and it has to be sort of a mixture of relevant, it has to be tremendously relevant, and it's through action and purpose. So we should think of opportunities like this, conferences, working at a company, at a nonprofit, mobilizing, being activists, as things that are sort of how we learn. And so this is what higher ed needs to do, I think. I'm not trying to sort of replace higher ed. I think higher ed has some really powerful things, but I think we attach ourselves too much to the wrong things. So I'm going to start with what to leave behind. Transactional credentials and accreditation. That's just a means to sort of monetize and create revenue. There's no sort of purpose to it beyond the monetization. And it's a barrier to access, and that's part of the artificial sort of quantification of like, let's create grades. None of us, I've taught for so many years, and I do not know what a C+ really means in terms of understanding or learning. Rubrics, evaluations, all of this is just so we can make this transactional. So higher ed needs to stop being sort of transactional and artificial. And really, but there are things about higher ed that I worry that we're losing. One of the things it provides, and that's the thing I would like to maintain in SETI, but we need to, is accessibility. You do not see any other space where you have access to a community that's different from you. You have access to expertise that you can reach out to and work with. You don't have higher ed. Learning really does not happen in a classroom. It happens in between. It happens in the gatherings you have, in the dorms, in informal conversations. And higher ed gives you an opportunity for that. It's immersive. You run across people. You can learn useless things. You can play and experiment and fail. And that's really also important. Learning is emergent, and so is innovation. Good ideas and expertise come out of having bad ideas and unexpected conversations with people who might not have the same expertise. So I think those are really things we need to maintain, and that's the project I'm working on now. But it's just a work in progress. And so it's how do you imagine education, research, and mobilization happening together? How do you create a community that crosses institutions and partnerships, does research in this very participatory way where everyone has a voice, and research and design in defining the questions, in designing the processes used, in creating the results and the stories, and how you use that together to sort of empower people to create this really deep network that's full of like trust and purpose that you can build, that you can learn together to become leaders. And so we get to define the future. Thank you.